Close your eyes. Imagine a city. Not just any city, the greatest city the ancient world had ever seen. A city of 1 million people, when most of the world lived in villages of a few hundred. A city of marble temples and towering aqueducts, of colosseums that held 80,000 roaring spectators, of roads so perfectly engineered that some of them are still walked upon today. Rome. For 1,000 years, Rome was the center of the known world. Its legions marched from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen forests of northern Britain. Its laws shaped every civilization that came after it. Its language became the root of half the tongues spoken in Europe today. And then it fell. Not in a single day, not in a single battle, not because of any one man or any one mistake. It fell slowly over centuries, like a great tree hollowed out from within, still standing, still impressive from the outside, until the day the wind finally pushed it over. Tonight we follow that long, slow fall. From the height of Roman power, through the cracks that slowly spread across the empire's foundations, through the invasions and the betrayals and the plagues and the corruption, all the way to that final, quiet moment in 476 AD, when the last Roman emperor in the West handed over his crown and walked away. It is one of the greatest stories in human history. A story that has haunted scholars and dreamers for 1,500 years. So settle in, let the marble cool beneath your feet, let the torchlight dim, and let Rome carry you gently to sleep. Part 1: The Height of Empires. To understand how Rome fell, you first need to understand what Rome was at its peak. In the 2nd century AD, roughly 100 to 180 years after the birth of Christ, the Roman Empire was the most powerful state the world had ever seen. Its territory stretched from Hadrian's Wall in northern England to the deserts of Mesopotamia in what is now Iraq, from the Rhine and Danube rivers in the north to the Sahara Desert in the south, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the eastern shores of the Black Sea. 50 million people lived within its borders, perhaps a third of the world's entire population. The roads that connected this vast territory were engineering marvels, straight, paved, precisely built, designed so that an army could march anywhere in the empire within weeks. Milestones marked every mile. Inns provided rest at regular intervals. The cities were extraordinary. Rome itself had running water piped from distant mountains through hundreds of miles of aqueducts, public baths where citizens could wash, exercise, and socialize for free, a system of grain distribution that fed the urban poor, courts of law, fire brigades, a postal service. The army, the legendary Roman legions, was the finest fighting force the ancient world had produced. Disciplined, professional, heavily armed, trained to build roads and bridges and fortifications as well as to fight. Each legionary was a soldier and an engineer simultaneously. The Roman peace, the Pax Romana, had lasted for over 2 centuries. Within the borders of the empire, a merchant could travel from Spain to Syria without crossing a hostile frontier, without paying tolls at every border, without fear of the organized violence that plagued the world beyond Rome's reach. It seemed to those who lived within it eternal. It was not. Part 2: The Seeds of Decline. The seeds of Rome's fall were planted long before anyone noticed them growing. Some of them were planted in the very nature of the empire itself. The first seed was size. The Roman Empire was simply too large to be governed effectively from a single center. Messages took weeks to travel from Rome to the frontiers. By the time news of a crisis reached the capital and orders were sent back, the situation had often changed entirely. Generals on the frontier had to make decisions that shaped the fate of the empire, and those decisions were not always wise and not always loyal. The second seed was the army. As the empire expanded, the legions became the most powerful force in Roman politics. Emperors who kept the army happy stayed in power. Emperors who did not were killed, often by their own soldiers. This created a brutal cycle. Emperors spent enormous sums of money buying the loyalty of the legions. This drained the treasury. To fill the treasury, they raised taxes. High taxes strangled the economy. A weaker economy meant less money for the army. A weaker army meant more instability. Around and around it went. The third seed was the question of succession. Rome never developed a stable system for passing power from one emperor to the next. There was no clear rule. Was the emperor's son automatically the heir? Could the Senate choose? Could the army? This ambiguity meant that almost every transition of power was accompanied by the possibility, and often the reality, of civil war. In the 3rd century AD, these seeds began to bear their terrible fruit. Part 3: The Crisis of the 3rd Century. The years between 235 and 284 AD are known to historians as the crisis of the 3rd century. It was the closest Rome came to complete collapse before the final fall. In those 50 years, there were over 50 emperors. Most of them were soldiers, generals who seized power by force, held it briefly, and were then killed by rivals. The average reign lasted less than 2 years. Some reigned for weeks. The frontiers buckled. Germanic tribes, the Alemanni, the Goths, the Vandals, poured across the Rhine and Danube, raiding deep into Roman territory. The Persian Empire in the east launched devastating invasions. At one point, the Emperor Valerian was captured by the Persian king Shapur I, the first Roman emperor ever taken prisoner by a foreign enemy. The empire briefly broke apart into 3 separate pieces: a breakaway Gallic Empire in the west, a breakaway Palmyrene Empire in the east, a rump Roman state in the middle. Trade collapsed, the currency was debased, emperors reduced the silver content of coins to stretch their money further, causing inflation that wiped out savings and disrupted commerce. Plague swept through the empire repeatedly, killing perhaps a third of the population in some regions. Cities that had thrived for centuries shrank, farms were abandoned, roads fell into disrepair. And yet somehow Rome survived. In 284 AD, a tough soldier named Diocletian seized the throne and began the process of reconstruction. Part 4: Diocletian and the Reforms. Diocletian was one of the most capable administrators in Roman history. He looked at the empire and understood with brutal clarity what needed to be done. First, he divided it. He created a system of 4 co-emperors, 2 senior emperors called Augusti, and 2 junior emperors called Caesars, each responsible for a different region of the empire. This was called the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. The logic was sound. The empire was too large for one man. By dividing responsibility, decisions could be made faster, crises responded to more quickly, frontiers defended more effectively. Second, he massively expanded the army and the bureaucracy. More soldiers to defend the frontiers, more officials to collect taxes and administer the empire. Third, he reformed the currency and the tax system. It worked for a time, the empire stabilized, the frontiers held, order was restored. But the reforms came at an enormous cost. The expanded army and bureaucracy required enormous sums of money. Taxes rose sharply. The peasants and small farmers who bore most of the tax burden were crushed. Many abandoned their land. It was simply not worth farming if the taxman took most of what you grew. Diocletian also launched the last great persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire, a brutal attempt to suppress a religion that he saw as a threat to Roman unity. It failed. Christianity could not be destroyed by persecution. And then Diocletian did something extraordinary for a Roman emperor. He retired. He abdicated voluntarily in 305 AD and went to live in a palace he had built on the Adriatic coast, in what is now split in Croatia, where he grew cabbages and refused to return to power even when asked. "If you could show the cabbage that I planted with my own hands to your emperor," he reportedly said to messengers begging him to return, "he definitely wouldn't dare suggest that I replace the peace and happiness of this place with the storms of a never-satisfied greed." He was the only Roman emperor to retire peacefully. His reforms, however, set the stage for the man who would come next. Part 5: Constantine and Christianity. Constantine the Great is one of the most consequential figures in Western history. He seized sole control of the Roman Empire in 324 AD after years of civil war among Diocletian's successors. A messy, violent period in which the tetrarchy collapsed into exactly the kind of power struggle it had been designed to prevent. Constantine was a military genius and a political visionary. He stabilized the empire, reformed the army, continued Diocletian's administrative improvements. But his most consequential act was religious. In 313 AD, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which guaranteed religious tolerance throughout the empire and specifically ended the persecution of Christians. Constantine himself converted to Christianity, or at least embraced it politically, which in practice amounted to the same thing. The effect was transformative. Christianity, which had been a persecuted minority religion, became first tolerated, then favored, then effectively the official religion of the Roman Empire. Churches were built with imperial funding. Christian bishops became powerful political figures. The resources of the empire were channeled into building the institutional church. Constantine also made another decision of enormous consequence. He moved the capital. He built a new city, Constantinople, on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, at the strategically perfect location where Europe meets Asia, where the Bosphorus Strait connects the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Constantinople was magnificent. Its location was nearly impregnable, protected on 3 sides by water, on the 4th by massive walls. It would remain the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire for over 1,000 years. But moving the capital east had consequences for the West. Rome, the old Rome, the city on the Tiber, began to decline in political importance. The western provinces, always poorer and less urbanized than the east, began to feel the neglect that comes from distance from power. The split between east and west, which Diocletian had formalized for administrative reasons, was deepening into something more permanent. Part 6: The Division of the Empire. After Constantine died in 337 AD, the empire passed through more civil wars, more short-lived emperors, more crises on the frontiers. One emperor stands out from this period, Julian, known as Julian the Apostate, who tried to reverse Constantine's religious revolution and restore the old Roman gods. He failed. He died on campaign in Persia in 363 AD, reportedly killed by a spear, possibly thrown by one of his own Christian soldiers. Christianity was too deeply embedded in the empire by then to be dislodged. The emperor who truly sealed the fate of the Western Empire was Theodosius I, who died in 395 AD. Theodosius was the last emperor to rule the entire Roman Empire, east and west together, as a single state. When he died, he divided the empire between his 2 sons. Arcadius, 18 years old, received the east, the wealthier, more urbanized, more defensible half, centered on Constantinople. Honorius, 10 years old, received the west, the poorer, more vulnerable half, centered nominally on Rome but effectively governed from the more defensible city of Ravenna in northern Italy. Neither boy was remotely capable of governing an empire. And on the frontiers, the pressure was building to a point of no return. Part 7: The Huns. To understand the final collapse of the Western Roman Empire, you need to understand the Huns. The Huns were a nomadic people from the steppes of Central Asia, from the vast grasslands north of the Caspian Sea and east of the Ural Mountains. We know relatively little about them. They left no written records. What we know comes from their terrified enemies. They were extraordinary horsemen. They could shoot arrows with devastating accuracy from the back of a galloping horse, a skill that took a lifetime to develop and that no settled infantry force could easily counter. They appeared on the frontiers of the Gothic peoples north of the Danube in the 370s AD, and they were devastating. The Goths, themselves a Germanic people who had been living on the northern edge of the Roman Empire for generations, were pushed, panicked and desperate, toward the Roman frontier. In 376 AD, hundreds of thousands of Goths appeared on the northern bank of the Danube, begging to be allowed to cross into Roman territory. This was an unprecedented situation. The Romans had accepted barbarian settlers before in small numbers on their own terms, But this was different, an entire people, armed and desperate, asking for refuge. The Emperor Valens agreed to let them cross. It was one of the most consequential decisions in Roman history. The Roman officials responsible for settling the Goths within the empire were corrupt and incompetent. They cheated the Goths on food supplies, they treated them with contempt, they pushed desperate people past the breaking point. The Goths rose in revolt. Part 8 Adrianople. On August 9, 378 AD, the Roman army met the Gothic forces near the city of Adrianople in what is now northern Turkey. The Battle of Adrianople was one of the most catastrophic defeats in Roman military history. The Emperor Valens himself commanded the Roman forces. He attacked without waiting for reinforcements, perhaps impatient, perhaps simply miscalculating the Gothic strength. The Gothic cavalry, returning from a foraging expedition, struck the Roman flanks at a critical moment. The Roman formation collapsed. The legions, packed too closely together to fight effectively, were cut down in enormous numbers. 2/3 of the Roman army was destroyed. The Emperor Valens was killed. His body was never found. According to one account, he was burned alive in a farmhouse where he had taken shelter. Adrianople shattered something in the Roman psyche. The legions, the invincible legions, had been destroyed by barbarian cavalry. The emperor was dead. The frontiers were open. From this point, the Western Roman Empire was managing a slow retreat. The new emperor Theodosius had no choice but to make peace with the Goths on their terms. They were settled within the empire as a largely autonomous group, maintaining their own leadership, their own customs, their own military structure. They were inside the empire now, but they were not Romans. Part 9, Stilicho and the Barbarian Generals. The decades after Adrianople saw a remarkable development, the increasing reliance of the Roman army on barbarian soldiers and barbarian generals. The most important of these was a man named Stilicho. Stilicho was half Vandal by birth. His father had been a barbarian cavalry officer in Roman service, but he had grown up entirely within the Roman world, risen through the ranks of the Roman army, and married into the imperial family. He was the most capable military commander of his generation, and for nearly 2 decades, he effectively ran the Western Roman Empire as regent for the young and incompetent Emperor Honorius. He fought off repeated invasions. He stabilized frontiers. He kept the empire alive through sheer force of ability. And then, in 408 AD, he was arrested on fabricated charges of treason and executed. His soldiers, many of them barbarians, were massacred across Italy. Their families were killed. Their property was seized. The message was clear: barbarian soldiers were not to be trusted. The result was predictable. Tens of thousands of experienced soldiers, their loyalty to Rome destroyed, went over to the enemy. Specifically, they went to Alaric. Part 10, Alaric and the Sack of Rome. Alaric was the king of the Visigoths, the western branch of the Gothic people who had crossed the Danube 30 years earlier. He had spent years trying to find a place for his people within the Roman system. He wanted a legitimate military command, land for his people to settle, recognition of his status. He had served Rome as a general. He had fought Rome as an enemy. He had negotiated, threatened, and pleaded. The Western court at Ravenna, dominated now by mediocre men following Stilicho's murder, refused to negotiate seriously. After Stilicho's death, Alaric marched on Rome. He besieged the city twice and negotiated ransoms. Enormous sums of gold and silver were paid to make him go away. But the court still refused his fundamental demands. In August of 410 AD, Alaric's forces entered Rome. For 3 days, they sacked the city. The sack of Rome in 410 AD sent shockwaves through the entire Roman world that are almost impossible to exaggerate. Rome had not been taken by a foreign enemy in 800 years, not since the Gauls had briefly occupied it in 390 BC. Rome was supposed to be eternal. Rome was the foundation of civilization itself. When the news reached St. Jerome in his monastery in Bethlehem, he wrote, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." The city was not destroyed. Alaric was, by the standards of ancient warfare, relatively restrained. He ordered his men not to harm those who took refuge in churches, and most of the buildings survived. The population was not massacred. But the psychological impact was total. If Rome could fall, anything could fall. Alaric died shortly after, before he could lead his people to settle in North Africa as he had planned. His followers buried him, according to legend, in the bed of a river, diverting the water to dig the grave, then redirecting it to hide the tomb forever. Part 11. The Empire dissolves. The decades after the sack of Rome saw the Western Empire dissolve piece by piece. In 406 AD, just before Alaric's sack, a massive group of Germanic peoples had crossed the frozen Rhine River on the last day of December, pouring into the Roman province of Gaul. Vandals, Suebi, Alans. They swept through Gaul, crossed the Pyrenees into Spain, and eventually crossed to North Africa, where the Vandal king Gaiseric established a kingdom centered on Carthage, the great city of Rome's ancient enemy. From Carthage, the Vandals controlled the sea lanes of the western Mediterranean. The grain supply to Rome, which had depended on North African wheat for centuries, was cut off or held hostage. In 455 AD, the Vandals sailed to Rome and sacked it again, this time more thoroughly. Britain had been abandoned by the Roman army in 410 AD, the troops withdrawn to defend the continent, leaving the Romanized British population to fend for themselves against raids from the north and east. Gaul was carved up between Germanic kingdoms, Spain was divided, North Africa was lost. What remained of the Western Roman Empire by the mid-5th century was essentially Italy, and even Italy was governed by whoever commanded the barbarian troops that made up most of the army. The emperors became increasingly ceremonial figures, occasionally useful to provide legitimacy to whoever actually held power, but personally irrelevant. Part 12. Attila the Hun. In the middle of this slow dissolution, a figure appeared who seemed capable of destroying what remained all at once. Attila, the king of the Huns, called by his enemies the Scourge of God. Attila had united the fractious Hun tribes under his sole command by killing his own brother. He was not, by the accounts that survive, a physically impressive man, short, broad, with a large head and small eyes, but he radiated a terrifying authority. He demanded tribute from both the Eastern and Western Roman empires, and received it for years because the alternative was worse. In 451 AD, Attila invaded Gaul with a massive army. He burned cities. He destroyed everything in his path. At the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, one of the largest battles of the ancient world, a combined Roman and Visigoth force under the Roman general Aetius fought Attila to a standstill. It was one of the last great Roman military victories. Attila withdrew from Gaul, then invaded Italy the following year. He burned cities in northern Italy. He marched toward Rome. And then he stopped. Pope Leo I rode out to meet him. What passed between them no one knows, but Attila turned back. Perhaps it was the Pope's intervention. Perhaps it was plague in his army. Perhaps it was the news that the Eastern Roman Emperor was sending troops. Perhaps it was simply that he had achieved his immediate goals. Attila died in 453 AD, on the night of his wedding to a new wife, of a nosebleed or perhaps of poisoning. His enormous empire died with him, fragmenting almost immediately among his sons. The immediate Hunnic threat was over. But the Roman Empire had nothing left with which to recover. Part 13. The Last Emperors. The last 2 decades of the Western Roman Empire are almost painful to read about. A succession of emperors, most of them puppets of one barbarian general or another, flickered briefly on the throne and were extinguished. The real power lay with men like Ricimer, a half-Visigoth, half-Suebian general who dominated the Western court for 16 years, making and unmaking emperors at will. Ricimer could not become emperor himself. Roman law prevented someone of barbarian birth from holding the title. so he ruled through proxies, disposing of them when they became inconvenient. The last capable general of the Western Empire was Aetius, the man who had stopped Attila at the Catalonian plains. He was called the last of the Romans by contemporaries. In 454 AD, the Emperor Valentinian III killed Aetius with his own hands during a meeting, reportedly slicing off his head with a sword. "You have cut off your right hand with your left," someone reportedly told Valentinian. Valentinian was assassinated by Aetius's former soldiers 6 months later. The Western Empire stumbled on for another 20 years. And then came Odoacer. Part 14, the end. Odoacer was a Germanic chieftain, possibly Syrian, possibly Hun, the sources disagree, who commanded a large force of barbarian soldiers in Roman service. In 476 AD, these soldiers demanded that they be given a third of the land in Italy, the standard arrangement by which barbarian federates were settled throughout the Western Empire. The Roman court refused. Odoacer led his men in revolt. The last Western Roman emperor was a young man named Romulus Augustulus, a name that drips with irony, combining the name of Rome's legendary founder with the diminutive of Augustus, the first emperor, Romulus the Little Augustus. He was perhaps 15 years old. He had been placed on the throne by his father, a general named Orestes, just 10 months earlier. When Odoacer defeated Orestes and marched on Ravenna, Romulus Augustulus did not fight. He could not fight. He had no army, no resources, no real power of any kind. Odoacer deposed him. And then, in a gesture that speaks volumes, he did not kill him. Romulus was a boy, he was not dangerous. Odoacer sent him into exile in a castle in southern Italy and gave him a pension. He did not appoint a new Western emperor. He sent the imperial regalia, the crown, the robes, the symbols of Roman authority, to the emperor in Constantinople, with a message saying that one emperor was enough for the whole Roman world. The Eastern emperor accepted the regalia. And that was it. No final battle, no dramatic last stand, no burning of the eternal city. Just a boy handing over a crown and walking away. The Western Roman Empire was over. Part 15, why did Rome fall? Historians have been arguing about this question for 1500 years. Edward Gibbon, whose monumental history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire was published in the 18th century, blamed Christianity, arguing that it turned Roman citizens away from civic virtue and military service toward heavenly rewards. Others have blamed the barbarian invasions, the sheer pressure of peoples in motion, driven by the Huns from the east, crashing against Rome's frontiers until they broke through. Others point to economic collapse, the debasement of the currency, the crushing tax burden, the decline of trade, the abandonment of farmland. Others blame lead poisoning. The Romans used lead extensively in their plumbing and their cookware, and lead poisoning causes cognitive decline. An empire poisoning its own ruling class, some have argued, would naturally make increasingly bad decisions. Others point to climate change, a period of cooling and drought in the 5th century that disrupted agriculture and contributed to the movements of peoples that overwhelmed the frontiers. The truth, as it almost always is with great historical questions, is that all of these things played a role. Rome did not fall for one reason. It fell for dozens of reasons, all feeding into each other over centuries, a slow compounding of weaknesses and misfortunes and bad decisions that eventually became impossible to overcome. What is remarkable, perhaps, is not that Rome fell. What is remarkable is that it lasted as long as it did. Part 16, what survived? And yet Rome did not entirely disappear. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we call the Byzantine Empire, survived for another 1,000 years after 476 AD. Constantinople did not fall until 1453, when the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II breached its walls after a siege of 53 days. For 1,000 years, the Byzantines called themselves Romans, spoke Latin in their legal documents, preserved the Roman legal tradition that still forms the backbone of law in much of the world today. In the West, the Catholic Church filled much of the administrative vacuum left by the empire's collapse. The Pope in Rome became the most powerful figure in Western Europe, a spiritual emperor, in a sense, carrying Roman authority into the medieval world. The Latin language did not die, it transformed, splitting into French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. The Romance languages, the languages of Rome, spoken today by hundreds of millions of people. Roman law survived, absorbed into the legal systems of every European nation. The concept of the citizen, of legal rights, of due process, these are Roman inheritances. Roman engineering survived too, the roads, the aqueducts, the architectural principles that shaped every building from medieval cathedrals to modern courthouses. The very calendar we use today is the Julian calendar, reformed by Julius Caesar, further adjusted by Pope Gregory XIII, a Roman calendar still ticking. Rome fell, but Rome never entirely went away. It persists in the languages we speak, the laws we live under, the cities built on Roman foundations, the very way we organize our world. In that sense, perhaps Rome is still falling, slowly, imperceptibly, its last echoes still fading across 15 centuries of time. Closing the long silence. And so the story of Rome's fall comes to rest. 1,000 years of history, from the city on 7 hills that conquered the Mediterranean world, to the boy emperor walking away from a crown that had lost its meaning. Emperors and generals, saints and barbarians, reformers and corruptors, men who tried to hold it together and men who tore it apart. What does it mean? Perhaps this, that nothing lasts forever, that even the greatest human achievements are temporary, that empires rise and fall and the world continues. But also that things do not simply vanish, that what Rome built in its laws and its languages and its roads and its ideas persisted long after the last emperor was gone, that the things worth preserving found ways to survive. The marble cools, the torches dim, the legions are gone. But somewhere in the stones of every European city, in the roots of every Romance word, in the structure of every legal system that descended from Roman law, Rome is still there. Still whispering. Let those whispers settle around you now, like dust in old light. Let the names grow quiet, Augustus, Constantine, Alaric, Attila, Romulus, Augustulus. Let the legions march away into the dark. There is nothing left to defend tonight. No frontiers to hold, no barbarians at the gate, no empire to save. Only the long, quiet dark. And sleep, soft, deep, dreamless sleep. Good night.